The year was 1868, and Louisiana still smelled of gunpowder, swamp water, and mourning. The war had left scars on every field, every face, every house that still managed to stand. But no ruin in Aurelia Parish was whispered about more than the Crosby plantation. The home itself was nothing more than a blackened skeleton of wood, its roof caved in, its windows empty sockets staring back at the land. The night it burned, no one dared to approach because the Crosbys were not a family one questioned. They were respected in the daylight, feared in the dark. Now they were gone, all 9 of them reduced to coffins that carried no bodies. The funeral drew the whole parish. Carriages lined the muddy road, mourners stepped into the churchyard, hats low, hands folded. 9 coffins sat before them, each polished, each heavy enough to require 6 men to carry. But when the pallbearers whispered, their eyes betrayed confusion. The weight was wrong. Not soft, not bone-filled, not the shifting burden of a body. Instead, a dense, dragging heaviness like barrels of earth. Some swore they smelled a dry, burnt scent rising when the lids were sealed with iron nails. Yet no one asked. To ask was to risk being silenced by the same fate. The preacher spoke of sorrow, of God's mysterious plans, of the fragility of flesh. But his voice wavered, and some said his hands shook as he pressed the Bible to his chest. No one dared look too closely at the coffins, for the Crosbys had been the kind who gave money to the parish and food to the starving, while their children never laughed and their windows never opened. When they perished in the fire, the town lowered its eyes and agreed to believe. Still, whispers moved like wind through the crowd. There are no bodies inside, only ash. The earth opened as 9 graves were dug in a neat row, dirt piled like small mountains at the edge of the yard. One by one the coffins descended, wood groaning under its strange burden. Each thud into the soil seemed heavier than the last. A mother pulled her child closer as the boy asked why no one was crying. No tears were shed, not even by the neighbors who had known the Crosbys for years. It was not grief that filled the yard. It was something colder, the kind of silence that carries dread. The fire that had taken them was spoken of only in fragments. Some said the flames rose too fast, swallowing the house in less than an hour, though the night was damp with rain. Others swore they saw Nathaniel Crosby himself standing on the lawn while the blaze consumed everything, his face calm, his eyes reflecting orange light but no fear. The children's shadows had been seen in the windows, motionless, not crying out. When the fire ended, there was no struggle, no screams remembered, just smoke, and then 9 coffins presented the next morning, as if prepared long before. What made the coffins heavier than flesh was a secret few dared to repeat. Those who had looked too closely swore they saw fine powder leaking from the seams, soft gray dust that clung to the skin like flour but carried the acrid bite of bone. A man who helped lift one swore he brushed against a fragment inside that was sharp as porcelain, shaped like a tooth. When he told his wife, she demanded he never speak of it again. The Crosbys were buried without question, without justice, without certainty. The soil covered the coffins, one layer after another, until only grass would remember where the family had once been. But as the final shovel of earth was pressed down, something in the town seemed to dim. Crows gathered on the branches above, silent, watching. The air felt pressed thin as though it carried a secret no one dared inhale. The townspeople dispersed quickly, heads bent, hearts locked away. In the weeks that followed, no flowers were left on the graves, no prayers were spoken at the site. Instead, people crossed the road to avoid it, mothers told children not to stare too long, and preachers preached of sin without names. What haunted them was not only the fire or the loss, but the suspicion that what lay underground was not death in its natural form. The Crosbys had left behind a presence, something unfinished, something wrong, And though the plantation house was gone, its ruins still smoked weeks later, as if the earth itself refused to cool. The smell of ash lingered, carried on the wind into the town, clinging to clothes, entering houses, reminding everyone that the graves they had filled did not hold the piece of bodies laid to rest, but something else. Something deliberately reduced, contained, and hidden. The coffins were not graves, they were warnings. And the parish, too afraid to uncover the truth, chose to let silence bury it deeper. Yet the silence would not last. What the Crosbys had become and what they had done was only beginning to surface. Nathaniel Crosby was the kind of man a town wanted to trust. His hands were steady, his voice calm, and his smile soft enough to pass for kindness. He walked the streets of Aurelia Parish like a quiet guardian, always ready to lend advice for fevers, cuts, or broken bones. They called him a healer, though he had no formal training. He gave herbs to the sick, stitched wounds for the poor, and comforted widows with scripture on his lips. In a world scarred by war, Nathaniel seemed a man untouched by bitterness. But those who lingered long enough in his presence noticed that his eyes never matched his smile. His gaze lingered too long on suffering, as if studying it rather than easing it. His plantation carried the image of prosperity. Fields of cane bent in the wind, livestock grazed fat and docile, and the house itself stood tall before the fire claimed it. Visitors left with baskets of food or a handwritten prayer from Nathaniel, tucked inside an envelope sealed with wax. He moved with the ease of a man at peace. Yet behind locked doors, Nathaniel was not a healer, but an observer of decay. Hidden beneath his floorboards and tucked inside drawers lined with cloth were notebooks filled with neat handwriting and precise drawings. In them he charted the weight of flesh before and after death, the hours it took for a body to lose warmth in different conditions, the changes in the color of eyes when air was denied for minutes too long. Neighbors believed Nathaniel's notebooks were ledgers, the business records of a careful landowner. They had seen him writing late at night, candlelight flickering against his window. But no one imagined the true nature of what he was recording. His entries carried the tone of an engineer dissecting machines, not a man reflecting on life. He noted the swelling of tongues in sealed boxes, the point at which hair began to fall from scalps exposed to quicklime, the exact number of days before silence broke a child's spirit. Between his careful words were strange symbols, triangles, circles divided into quadrants, spirals that repeated across pages as if representing cycles no one else could decipher. To him, these were formulas of obedience, proofs of suffering turned into ash. His smile became his mask, his shield against suspicion. When the town gathered for Sunday service, Nathaniel sat in the front pew with Margaret at his side, their children lined up in perfect order behind them. He bowed his head at every prayer, donated more than any other family, and greeted his neighbors by name. Yet the children never spoke, not even to each other, and no one thought to ask why. Their silence seemed like discipline, the mark of a father raising them with care. In truth, it was the result of experiments carefully logged in the margins of Nathaniel's notebooks. He had calculated the length of silence required to fracture natural speech, charted the withering of voices forced into stillness, and found comfort in their obedience. The townspeople admired Nathaniel's generosity, but beneath their gratitude was unease. When he entered a room, conversations dulled. When he touched a shoulder, the warmth of his hand seemed to linger too long. His gaze made people feel as though their pain was being measured, weighed, and tucked away for later use. He listened to grief with unusual focus, his questions probing not for comfort but for details. How long a man had suffered, what hour of the night his wife had passed, how a child had stopped breathing. To Nathaniel, these were not tragedies but data. Margaret was the one who explained away his oddities, She told neighbors that Nathaniel was simply a man of strong faith, one who studied God's design with precision. She assured them that the strange marks in his ledgers were prayers written in an old family code. But in the quiet of night, Nathaniel did not pray. He calculated, he drew, he planned. His handwriting was meticulous, each stroke shaped as though permanence mattered more than meaning. And when he smiled at Margaret, it was not love but satisfaction, for she kept his secrets as tightly as he did. Years later, when fragments of those notebooks were found in the ashes of the house, investigators struggled to interpret them. Some pages showed careful lines tracking the density of human ash compared to animal remains. Others held drawings of boxes with slits no wider than a finger marked with notes about airflow and duration. The symbols remained unsolved, but some believed they were not code at all, but ritual, a set of personal commandments he had written to guide his work. His smile in memory became less the mark of kindness and more the shadow of cruelty disguised as grace. Nathaniel Crosby built a reputation of generosity so strong that no one ever dared question what he did in the privacy of his home. He was the man who healed others, yet he was also the man who studied the breaking of flesh, the extinguishing of breath, the silencing of voice. His notebooks revealed not a healer's compassion but a collector's obsession. And when the day came that the coffins carried only ash, the town realized too late that Nathaniel's smile had never been for them. It had always been for himself. Margaret Crosby was a figure of contradiction. To the townspeople she appeared delicate, a woman wrapped in shawls, her eyes lowered in modesty, her voice thin as smoke. She rarely left the house, yet when she did, she moved with an unsettling calm, as if floating above the ground rather than stepping on it. In the parish, she was seen as pious, always clutching her Bible, her lips whispering prayers that no one could quite hear. But those who visited the Crosby home remembered a different image, one that clung to them long after they left. Margaret did not preside over her household as a mother or wife. She ruled it like a silent priestess, her chair set in the center of the room, her children circling her in patterns that made no sense to the human mind. The children never spoke in her presence. They walked with precision, stepping heel to toe in measured rhythm, tracing shapes that seemed meaningless at first glance. But the longer one watched, the clearer it became that the patterns repeated. Circles folding into squares, steps forming crosses that bent into spirals. It was as though their movements were rehearsed, memorized, drilled into them until their bodies obeyed without thought. Neighbors who caught glimpses through open doors claimed they heard no words, no singing, only the sound of feet brushing against the wooden floor in perfect unison. What disturbed them most was the silence, for it was not the silence of children behaving. It was the silence of ritual, heavy and unnatural, as though something else pressed against the air. Margaret's eyes told the truth her mouth never confessed. They were hollow, deep sockets that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. When she looked at her children, it was not with warmth but with expectation, as if they were vessels being shaped for a purpose only she and Nathaniel understood. She would sit unmoving for hours, watching as the children repeated their motions, correcting them with a single gesture of her hand. A lifted finger sent them back to begin again. A closed fist meant they must stop and bow their heads. Witnesses spoke of the way she tapped her foot against the floor, steady, rhythmic, commanding them without words. In those moments, Margaret seemed less a fragile widow and more an executioner of discipline disguised in piety. Her Bible was always near, though no one ever saw her read from it in church. At home, she would open it and turn the pages slowly, not to scripture but to the cut-out spaces where slips of paper were hidden. Those papers contained instructions in Nathaniel's hand, measurements, drawings, sequences of movement. She read them with devotion, nodding as if they were revelations from God. Then she would fold them back into the book, her fingers stroking the edges as though caressing skin rather than paper. Her faith became the perfect disguise, a mask that kept her neighbors from asking why her children never played outside, why their voices never lifted in laughter. There were nights when servants whispered of strange sounds rising from the Crosby house. Not music, not speech, but the faint hum of breath released in controlled rhythm, as though the children were forced to exhale in patterns while Margaret counted. Sometimes the windows revealed candlelight arranged in geometrical forms, 4 flames in a square, 9 in a circle, each one burning until wax overflowed and hardened like frozen tears on the sill. And always Margaret watched, her hollow eyes never closing, her fragile frame motionless, as if feeding on their obedience. Her cruelty did not carry the sharpness of Nathaniel's experiments. It carried something colder, something more patient. While Nathaniel dissected the body, Margaret stripped away the soul. Her children became extensions of her will, their individuality carved away step by step until they were nothing but shadows orbiting her chair. She spoke little, yet her silence was more commanding than any word. The town pitied her for her fragility, but in truth she was the center of power, the one who ensured that Nathaniel's notebooks were not theories but practice, drilled into the flesh of their own blood. What unsettled neighbors most was the way the children obeyed without hesitation. Even the youngest, barely able to walk, moved in perfect rhythm around Margaret's chair. When visitors entered, the children would stop, heads bowed, their eyes never meeting a stranger's gaze, and Margaret would smile faintly, a smile that carried no joy, only the satisfaction of control. Some guests left with the impression that she had already rehearsed their visit, that the children's movements were not for themselves but for demonstration, proof of her dominion. When Nathaniel's smile made people uneasy, Margaret's silence made them afraid. Her hollow eyes seemed to see through flesh into marrow, as though she were weighing the worth of every person who entered her home. Women avoided her touch, men lowered their gaze, and children cried when they saw her face. Yet still, no one spoke against her. Her role as mother, widow, and pious woman shielded her from suspicion, just as Nathaniel's reputation as a healer shielded him. Together they built a house of ritual in plain sight, a place where obedience was sculpted, where silence was worshipped, and where their children's humanity was burned away long before the fire consumed the house itself. The parish remembered Margaret Crosby as fragile, but the truth that lingered was far more disturbing. She was the quiet architect of ritual, the silent judge behind the children's movements, the hollow-eyed matriarch who turned obedience into worship. And though the town buried her alongside Nathaniel and the children, the image that remained was not of a grieving widow, but of a woman who had already given herself to something darker, long before the fire reduced her to ash. The Crosby children were remembered as angelic, their faces pale and smooth, their eyes wide and unblinking. They were always dressed in clean linen, white collars pressed flat, their hair combed neatly back. When they followed their parents into town, they moved in perfect rows, their steps matching as if rehearsed. They never laughed, never cried, and never spoke. To the people of Aurelia Parish, the silence of children seemed like a blessing. At first, they called it discipline, proof of a household guided by God's order. But the longer one watched them, the more disturbing that silence became. The children did not interact with each other as siblings should. They did not whisper secrets, push shoulders, or exchange glances of mischief. They moved like extensions of one body, eyes fixed forward, their hands folded neatly against their stomachs. Mothers whispered to each other that the Crosby children seemed hollow, as though some part of them had already been carved out. Fathers frowned when they noticed the marks on their hands, blisters that cracked and bled despite the softness of their age. The boys wore gloves to cover them, the girls lowered their sleeves, but in moments of carelessness the injuries showed. The blisters were not the result of work in the fields. These children had never lifted tools. Their wounds carried a different shape: raised welts, circular burns, strange red patches on the palms that suggested contact with surfaces heated or treated in unnatural ways. Some swore they saw faint scars that mirrored symbols, marks pressed into flesh like branding, though no one dared confirm it aloud. And always their hair seemed wrong. Even the youngest, no more than 6, had thin strands falling in clumps, leaving patches of scalp pale beneath. By adolescence, their hair had dulled to the brittle texture of straw, as if drained of life. Nathaniel and Margaret explained away these changes. They told neighbors that sickness lingered in their blood, that the children were frail but chosen, vessels of purity marked by God's testing hand. Yet no physician was ever summoned, no medicine was ever purchased from town. The children bore their frailty in silence, their bodies reflecting something consuming them from within, something unseen but deliberate. Their quietness became a shield, their fragility a mask, but beneath it lay a pattern that grew darker each year. Visitors to the house told stories they tried to forget. They recalled stepping into the parlor and finding the children arranged in rigid formation around their mother's chair, circling in complete silence, their bare feet tapping against the wooden floor in unison. Their eyes were unfocused, fixed not on the visitor but on some point far beyond, as though they were walking for something that did not exist in the room. Others remembered the children sitting at long tables with plates of food untouched before them, staring blankly while Margaret recited prayers in whispers. The meals ended without a bite taken, and the children would rise with obedience, leaving plates cold and full. The silence was not only absence of voice, it was a burden carried by the entire household. Some said the children were punished for speaking, forced into chambers where sound was impossible. Others believed they were trained to erase their voices entirely, so that even in fear or pain no cry would escape. That discipline left its mark. When they fell, they did not scream. When they were cut, they did not wail. They only lowered their heads, their eyes dim with resignation. To the town it seemed saintly. To those who saw it up close, it seemed monstrous. The children's pale skin grew thinner as the years passed. Veins showed blue beneath, their eyes sank deeper into sockets, and their bodies carried a stiffness unnatural for youth. Yet Nathaniel and Margaret paraded them through town as if they were trophies of virtue. They sat in the front pews of the church, heads bowed low, their silence louder than any hymn. Some parishioners claimed they felt the air change when the Crosby children entered, as though breath itself grew heavy, pressing on the chest, making the congregation struggle to sing. The truth buried in Nathaniel's notebooks revealed why the children appeared so consumed. They were subjects of his and Margaret's rituals, their bodies tested against deprivation, silence, and exposure. Their hair fell because their diets were altered, stripped of nutrients, and fed only what kept them weak and pliable. Their hands blistered because they were forced to press against heated surfaces, trained to endure pain without sound. Their eyes hollowed because they had been denied the normal rhythms of childhood, replaced by endless repetition of motions that erased identity. Each one was broken down until nothing human remained beyond obedience. And yet, despite their frailty, the children carried an aura that unsettled everyone who saw them. Their silence was not empty. It was watchful, heavy, as though they had learned to hold secrets too great for their age. When they passed in their white collars and pale faces, townsfolk felt as if the children carried with them a residue of something inhuman, something that had been placed inside them where laughter should have been. By the time the fire consumed the house, the children had already been erased, What the flames devoured was not innocence lost, but shadows of what they once might have been. And when the coffins lowered into the ground carried only ash. It was not only the parents' work that was buried, but the silence of 9 children whose voices had been stolen long before the blaze. Among the scattered ruins of the Crosby home, investigators years later uncovered fragments of diaries charred but not destroyed. The handwriting was Nathaniel's, neat and unshaken, his words methodical and cold. In them he described what he called transmutations, a process of reducing flesh to ash without the use of fire. To him, flame was crude, unpredictable, and destructive. He sought something slower, something that preserved what he called the purity of essence. He wanted ash that carried memory, ash that had shape and meaning, ash that could be contained like treasure. The first method described was starvation, but not in the ordinary sense. His notes explained a process of deprivation calculated to the hour. Victims were placed in controlled isolation, denied food in patterns rather than complete absence. A small meal would be given, then withheld for days, then offered again, creating a rhythm of hope and collapse. He charted the weight of bodies against the passage of time, recording how long it took for skin to loosen from muscle, how quickly eyes dulled, how silence settled once strength was gone. What horrified readers was not only the cruelty but the precision. Each stage was logged like the steps of an experiment, the handwriting calm, the words free of doubt. Another entry revealed his fascination with quicklime. He had constructed sealed chambers, wooden boxes lined with layers of the substance where he placed those chosen for his work. Quicklime ate the body without flame, pulling moisture until the skin shriveled, the bones weakened, and flesh collapsed into fragments. He wrote of the hiss of chemical hunger, the way breath shortened inside the chamber, the sound of fingernails scratching wood until they too dissolved. His tone was not one of regret. It was one of awe, as though he had found a scientific truth that no one else had dared to uncover. To him, the sight of a body turning to chalky residue was not death, but a revelation. The most disturbing method described in his diaries was suffocation in sealed boxes. These were not ordinary coffins. They were constructed with air vents small enough to prolong breathing, keeping the victim alive for hours, sometimes days, as the oxygen diminished. He noted how long the body resisted when panic gave way to stillness, when the skin grew mottled, when the chest rose one last time and collapsed forever. When the box was opened, what remained was not a corpse in the usual sense, but a body dried, brittle, collapsing into dust with the brush of a hand. Nathaniel recorded this with satisfaction, convinced that he had found a way to erase flesh while leaving behind the essence he called pure ash. Margaret's role appeared in the margins. Some entries suggested she prepared the victims, whispering prayers, pressing their hands into ritual positions, placing crosses carved into wood upon their chests before sealing them inside. Her faith was twisted into function, a way of sanctifying the process, disguising cruelty as devotion. The children, too, were not spared involvement. Notes described how they were instructed to watch silently as quicklime hissed or as a box was nailed shut. Their eyes trained not to blink, their voices forbidden to break the silence. Nathaniel wrote that the presence of witnesses was crucial. He believed the act of watching shaped obedience, that suffering observed without compassion became a foundation for control. In his words, the ash was not waste, it was evidence. He collected it in jars, labeled and dated, lined neatly on shelves hidden behind walls. He measured the weight of ash compared to the original flesh, noting the ratio, always searching for patterns. He described ash that carried different textures depending on the method. Fine powder from starvation, heavier fragments from suffocation, chalky clumps from quicklime. To him, each variation was valuable. each jar a record of transformation. He spoke of them not as remains but as perfected states of being. The townspeople never saw the jars, never knew that while they were greeted with kindness by Nathaniel in the daylight, behind the walls of his house entire shelves of human residue sat in silence. Some speculated later that the jars perished in the fire, but others believed they survived, buried in the soil, waiting to be uncovered. What lingered was the knowledge that the Crosbys had practiced not only cruelty but ritual, turning death into a process of study, reducing life to weight, ratio, and dust. The ash rituals became the darkest truth of the Crosby story. They revealed that the coffins lowered into the ground after the fire carried not bodies but the results of years of calculated experiments. And though the town tried to bury the memory, the thought of those jars, lined neatly, labeled and preserved, haunted every whisper that followed. For ash cannot speak, yet it holds what was taken. And in Aurelia Parish, the earth itself seemed heavy with the memory of all that had been reduced to dust by Nathaniel Crosby's hand. For years, the Crosby plantation appeared to be a place of quiet refuge. Travelers passing through Aurelia Parish spoke of being welcomed with politeness at the Crosby home. Salesmen with wagons full of goods, weary drifters in search of shelter. Even parish priests on their rounds found the gates open and the doors unlocked. Nathaniel or Margaret would greet them with calm smiles, offering food, water, and a bed for the night. The Crosbys gained a reputation for Christian charity, for kindness that stood in contrast to the harshness of the post-war South. But the truth whispered by those who paid attention was that many who entered never returned. The disappearances at first blended into the chaos of the times. The war had left men scattered, families torn apart, names lost to hunger and illness. A salesman vanishing was not unusual. A drifter moving on without farewell raised no suspicion. But in Aurelia Parish, a pattern took shape. Weeks after a visitor stayed at the Crosby house, the earth behind the plantation would swell. Fresh mounds appeared in the soil, dark patches where grass refused to grow. Neighbors passing by at dusk claimed to hear the scrape of shovels, the dull thud of earth falling back into holes. By dawn, the ground would appear smoothed, though never clean. Some tried to ignore it, telling themselves the Crosbys were burying livestock or disposing of ash from the fields, but others remembered the names of men who had come into town and failed to leave. A peddler who sold glassware, last seen carrying his samples into the Crosby gate. A young priest assigned temporarily to the parish who preached once and then disappeared. A soldier too weak to travel further, whose horse was later found tied near the river with no rider to claim it. Their absence left no official trace, for Nathaniel assured anyone who asked that they had moved on, grateful for rest. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering, and no one dared accuse him openly. The diaries later revealed that these visitors were more than chance victims. They were chosen carefully, their presence documented in Nathaniel's notebooks. He described them by trade, by age, by physical condition, noting their weaknesses as if cataloging specimens. The salesman's lungs were fragile. The priest's faith was strong. The soldier's body was already worn by fever. Each was placed into his rituals with calculated purpose, their remains reduced to the ash he collected. Margaret played her part by welcoming them with gentle words, preparing meals that were never truly meant to nourish, and leading them into rooms with beds already prepared for containment. The children too were present. Witnesses recalled seeing them at windows when strangers arrived. Their pale faces staring without emotion, their hands pressed against the glass. Some believed they were trained to watch the process, to learn obedience by witnessing the erasure of outsiders. Their silence became complicit, their presence ensuring that no visitor could mistake the nature of the house. Those who entered were already being studied long before the doors closed behind them. The soil behind the house became a map of hidden graves. Uneven ridges revealed the passing of time, older mounds sinking while new ones rose. Rain would wash away the top layers, exposing fragments too small to confirm but too human to deny. A shard of tooth, a strip of fabric, a nail once belonging to a shoe. Farmers working nearby turned their eyes away, muttering prayers as they passed, pretending not to notice how the land refused to settle. But unease spread quietly. The Crosbys were both admired and fear always silenced questions. What lingered most in memory was the way Nathaniel justified his actions to himself. His notes suggested he believed he was offering salvation. Strangers had no place, no family in Aurelia Parish. To him, their disappearance was not tragedy but purification. By turning them into ash, he claimed he was releasing them from the burden of wandering, giving their essence permanence where their lives had none. His logic was not born of madness but of method, a twisted faith in transformation. The parish priest who vanished was described in his diary as a willing vessel, though the truth was likely far different. When the fire consumed the house years later, the mounds behind it were still visible, though no one dared to dig. After the funeral, whispers spread that the earth still shifted in unnatural ways, as if the ground itself remembered. The names of those who vanished were never spoken in church again. Their absence folded into the silence the Crosbys had left behind. For the parish, it was easier to forget than to admit that hospitality had been the mask for ritual, that kindness had been the snare. The visitors who never returned were not simply lost. They had been absorbed into the machinery of the Crosby family's cruelty, their voices extinguished, their bodies reduced, their memory erased from record. Yet the land behind the house remained restless, a scar in the soil that no grass could cover. And in that scar lay the truth. Every guest who entered the Crosby home had been given lodging, not in beds, but in the ground. Margaret Crosby was remembered as a woman of faith. In church, she bowed her head so low her chin nearly touched her chest, her thin hands folded tightly around a worn Bible bound in black leather. She whispered prayers in a voice too faint for anyone to catch, her lips trembling as if in constant devotion. To the town, she seemed fragile, pious, even saintly, a woman who had given her life to God and family. But in the ruins of her home, hidden inside her sewing chest beneath folded linen, investigators found a Bible that was not made for worship. It was made for ritual. The book looked ordinary from the outside. Its leather cover was faded, its edges worn by years of use, its spine cracked. But when it was opened, the pages told a different story. Many of the original scriptures had been cut out, carved carefully from the binding. In their place were strips of pale material stitched crudely into the spine. When tested years later, that material revealed itself not as parchment, but as human skin, preserved and thinned until it could be written on. Across those strips, ink formed passages rewritten in Margaret's hand, instructions not of salvation but of control. The words were simple yet twisted. Where Scripture once spoke of sacrifice as devotion, Margaret's version described sacrifice as erasure. Bodies were to be weakened until they no longer resisted, their silence proof that the soul had been purified. Obedience was not framed as virtue, but as the only path to preservation. Pain was written as a tool, a process by which the flesh was stripped away to reveal essence. In one passage, she replaced the psalm of protection with her own version, commanding children to walk in circles until their voices dissolved, to starve willingly so their bodies might be reduced to ash without corruption. Her Bible was not a book of faith. It was a manual for ritual. Between these rewritten verses were notes, instructions that matched Nathaniel's diaries but carried Margaret's own tone. She described how to position a body within a box so that suffocation would occur gradually, how to bind hands so blisters would form in perfect circles, how to heat metal until it marked skin without breaking bone. She spoke of ashes as holy residue, jars of dust as vessels more sacred than living flesh. Her handwriting was steady, careful, without hesitation. Where Nathaniel approached his work as study, Margaret approached it as prayer. What made the Black Bible more disturbing was the presence of symbols drawn in the margins. Crosses inverted, circles divided into quarters, lines connecting shapes into patterns that repeated again and again. Some pages bore small smears of dried blood, pressed into the paper as if sealing the words with sacrifice. On others, fragments of hair had been glued between lines, thin and brittle strands that matched the pale shades of the Crosby children. The book became not only a guide but a reliquary, each page infused with the remnants of those consumed by the family's rituals. Margaret's devotion was not the devotion the parish believed. To her, obedience was not about love of God but submission to silence. She taught her children to see pain as prayer, to walk in patterns as worship, to watch suffering as proof of faith. Every page of her Bible confirmed that her piety was a mask, and beneath it lay a woman who believed salvation came only through destruction. When neighbors recalled her whispering during services, they realized later that she was not repeating scripture at all. She was reciting the verses she had written in flesh, prayers of control, mantras of erasure. The Bible explained what no one had dared to speak. It revealed why the children were silent, why visitors vanished, why ashes filled the coffins instead of bodies. Margaret believed she was guiding souls through transformation, stripping away what was human to preserve what she considered eternal. Her faith was not broken by Nathaniel's cruelty. It was fused with it, sanctified by her hand. Together they had built a theology of horror, binding their experiments with words carved into skin and scripture twisted into commands. When the Black Bible was uncovered, its pages brittle, its smell thick with decay, even hardened investigators refused to touch it for long. Some swore the book carried a presence, that holding it made the air colder, that the ink seemed to darken when exposed to light. Whether those claims were truth or superstition, the effect was the same. The Bible became a symbol of the family's corruption, proof that their evil was not only physical but spiritual, written and preserved as though to pass on to others. The parish tried to bury the discovery, to lock the Bible away, to keep its pages from reaching public eyes. But its memory lingered in whispers. Mothers warned children never to touch abandoned books. Fathers swore that prayers spoken too often in silence could invite darkness. Margaret's hollow eyes were remembered not as fragility but as devotion to something unspeakable, her faith exposed as the foundation of ritual that destroyed every soul under her roof. And though her body was reduced to ash in the fire, her Black Bible remained as the most haunting proof that belief, when corrupted, can sanctify even the cruelest of acts. Silence was the true language of the Crosby house. It filled every room, coated the walls, and lingered like a presence that could not be expelled. The children did not laugh, they did not cry, and they did not speak. What little voice they once had was not taken suddenly, but through a series of experiments that Nathaniel and Margaret described in fragments of their writings. To them, sound was weakness. The voice was a flaw to be corrected, a reminder of individuality that had no place in their household of ritual. And so they worked to erase it, not with sudden cruelty, but with slow, deliberate training that broke the children one by one. The most disturbing accounts came from servants and visitors who lived long enough to tell what they had seen. They described chambers built within the walls of the house, rooms small and padded with layers of cloth and straw. Once the heavy doors shut, no sound could escape, not even a scream. Children were placed inside for hours at first, then days, stripped of light and voice, left only with their own heartbeat echoing in their ears. The silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating, pressing against the mind until thought itself began to collapse. Nathaniel recorded the effects with precision. He noted how long it took for panic to set in, when fists began pounding against walls, when voices broke into desperate cries that no one outside could hear. He described how the body weakened as days passed, how voices strained until they cracked, how sobs turned into gasps and then fell into silence. Margaret stood outside those doors, listening not for sound, but for the absence of it. To her, each child who emerged quieter than before was proof of progress. Those who broke under the pressure of silence never truly recovered. Witnesses recalled seeing children led out of the chambers with hollow expressions, their lips trembling but producing no sound. They would try to speak, and only a breath would escape, no louder than a sigh. Some never attempted words again, their throats reduced to whispers that faded into nothing. Nathaniel wrote that these children had been hollowed, stripped of the flaw of voice, perfected into silence. He spoke of them not as damaged, but as elevated, free from the burden of sound. The process was repeated until none of the 9 Crosby children dared to utter a word. Even outside the chambers, they carried the silence with them, walking in unison, never breaking formation, never asking questions. They learned to communicate through obedience alone, responding only to the gestures of Margaret's hand or the fixed stare of Nathaniel's eyes. What little individuality remained in them was erased, their voices buried deeper than any grave. To the outside world, they appeared angelic, disciplined, perhaps unusually devout. But the truth was far darker. They had been mutilated without scars, their humanity cut away by silence. The chambers themselves were built with intention. Nathaniel's notes described their construction in detail, the padding thick enough to absorb every sound, the doors sealed tight so no breath could leak into the halls. He recorded the cost of cloth, the weight of nails, the number of hours required to ensure that once inside, the children would feel completely alone. He tested the rooms by locking animals inside first, recording how long they cried before falling silent. When the children replaced them, he already knew the pattern of suffering he expected. Margaret made the silence holy, instructing the children beforehand that they entered not a chamber but a sanctuary, a place where obedience was proved through endurance. What disturbed investigators most when these writings surfaced years later was the tone of detachment. Nathaniel did not describe torture. He described correction. He spoke of sound as an infection to be cut out, silence as the cure. Each entry read less like cruelty and more like instruction, a manual for how to destroy the voice without spilling blood. The chilling part was how effective it had been. By the time the fire consumed the house, not one of the 9 children was capable of crying out, even as flames licked at their skin. The parish never spoke openly of the padded rooms. The ruins revealed little, only fragments of wood, scraps of cloth, and nails blackened by fire. Yet survivors who had glimpsed those chambers in life swore they carried the memory of them forever. They described the smell of damp straw, the feel of heavy air, the way silence inside was so complete it rang in the ears like a scream. They swore they could still hear the faint scratching of fingernails against wood, desperate and unheard. In the end, the experiments in soundlessness created not only obedient children but a family that carried silence as its curse. To the world outside, they seemed peaceful. Inside, they were hollowed, stripped of voice, reduced to shadows moving in patterns. Their silence was not innocence. It was the sound of humanity erased, the echo of a ritual that consumed the living without leaving a mark. And it was that silence more than the ash or the fire that haunted Aurelia Parish long after the Crosbys were gone. The night the Crosby plantation burned was remembered as a storm-choked evening when the sky split open with thunder and rain fell in sheets. Lightning lit the fields like a strobe, turning the cane stalks into black spears against the glow. Yet within that storm, fire rose where it should never have survived. Witnesses said the flames burst from the Crosby house with unnatural force, racing across the timbers, devouring walls that should have been too soaked to ignite. Neighbors rushed toward the glow, their lanterns bobbing in the downpour, but what they found chilled them more than the fire itself. Nathaniel Crosby stood in the yard, his figure outlined by orange light, his hands folded calmly in front of him. His face carried the same faint smile he had worn in church pews and town gatherings, as though the destruction behind him was no more troubling than a candle's flicker. Some claimed he looked almost relieved. Others swore his lips moved as though in prayer. When the neighbors shouted, demanding to know if his children and wife were trapped inside, he gave no answer. He only raised a hand, palm outward, as if to command them to stop. Through the windows of the burning house, the shadows of the 9 children were seen. They stood still, lined in rows, their figures unmoving even as flames licked up the walls around them. No screams pierced the night, no cries for help. Witnesses spoke later with trembling voices, saying it was as though the children had accepted the fire, their silence holding even as the heat shattered glass and swallowed the rooms. Margaret's figure appeared once at an upstairs window, her hollow eyes reflecting the blaze, her lips moving silently in words no one could hear. She vanished in the smoke, and none saw her again. The neighbors tried to run forward, but Nathaniel blocked them. His calm presence was more terrifying than the flames themselves. He did not shout, he did not struggle. He simply refused to allow anyone past him, his eyes cold and certain. Some swore that when they tried to push closer, the heat grew unbearable, as if the fire itself pushed them back. The storm raged overhead, yet the house continued to burn as though the rain had no power. They stood helpless as the roof collapsed, the walls fell inward, and the screams that should have filled the air never came. By morning, the fire had burned itself into silence. Smoke rose from the blackened skeleton of the house, drifting into the gray sky. The cane fields around it were untouched, wet with rain, while the house itself had been reduced almost entirely to ash. The neighbors returned, expecting to find the charred remains of a family, bones scattered among the ruin. But instead they found nothing. No skeletons, no bodies, only heaps of gray powder and shards of wood. It was as if the family had been reduced before the fire, as though the blaze had been a mask for what had already been done. That very morning, before anyone could question further, 9 coffins appeared at the site. They were sealed with iron nails, polished wood gleaming, each one heavy enough to require 6 men to move. No one saw who had built them or how they had been delivered so quickly. Some swore Nathaniel himself had arranged them before the fire began, that he had prepared for the burial long before the flames touched his house. The townspeople, terrified by the unnatural destruction, did not argue. They carried the coffins to the churchyard, their shoulders straining under the weight, their minds filled with dread. Whispers spread as they lowered the coffins into the earth. The heaviness felt wrong. The men who bore them claimed the burden shifted not like flesh, but like dense earth, compact and unyielding. A faint trail of powder leaked from one seam, clinging to their hands with the bitter sting of burnt bone. No one dared open them, no one dared demand proof. In silence, the graves were filled, the soil pressed down, and the parish pretended that the fire had taken the Crosbys whole. But the truth clawed at them all. There had been no screams, no bodies, only ash. The night of fire became a story that spread beyond Aurelia Parish, whispered with unease in towns along the river. Some believed it was God's judgment punishing the Crosbys for hidden sins. Others believed Nathaniel had orchestrated the fire to conceal his work, turning his family and victims into ash before the flames ever touched the wood. The storm, the silence, the calm smile on his face. These were details repeated in hushed voices for generations. Yet one truth could not be erased. When the neighbors stood in the rain that night watching the flames devour the house, they felt no panic, no chaos. What haunted them was the order of it, the way the fire seemed not wild but controlled, as if it were the final ritual of a family that had already chosen silence over life. And when the coffins sank into the ground the next morning filled only with ash, the parish buried not just the Crosbys but the weight of their own fear. Decades after the fire, when most who had witnessed the Crosbys' final night were already gone, the graves were disturbed. Rumors had never settled, and the parish carried a sickness of memory that refused to fade. Local officials, pressed by whispers and unease, ordered the ground to be opened in quiet secrecy. The churchyard was still, the air heavy when the first coffin was lifted from the soil. They expected rot, perhaps fragments of bone clinging to cloth, the natural ruin of bodies long buried. What they found instead was dust. When the iron nails were pried loose, a faint gray cloud rose into the air, drifting like smoke before dissolving into the morning light. Inside lay not skeletons, not the frames of a family consumed by fire, but powder as fine as silt, mixed with shards that gleamed unnaturally. One investigator lifted a fragment between his fingers and saw it was no bone but porcelain. The remnants of false teeth meant to trick the living into believing flesh had once rested there. At the bottom of the box, tangled in the dust, were strips of ribbon still faintly pink, the kind a child might wear in her hair. They were not remnants of life, but tokens placed carefully as if to suggest innocence where none remained. Coffin after coffin revealed the same truth. Not one contained a body. Each was filled with dust too uniform to be the product of fire alone, dust that carried the texture of flesh reduced by unnatural means. The fragments of porcelain, the scraps of fabric, the brittle strands of hair told a story no one wanted to write down. The Crosbys had not been buried at all. They had been erased, their remains reduced to ash long before the flames touched their home. The fire had been only the final disguise, the ritual's closing act. Officials who oversaw the exhumations grew pale and silent. Some refused to touch the contents, covering their mouths as if the dust itself carried infection. They took notes at first, recording weights, textures, and observations, but as the pattern became undeniable, the pen slowed. What was discovered could not be explained in language the public would accept. To admit the truth was to confess that for years the parish had buried not a family but an illusion, that the coffins lowered into the earth had been empty of flesh from the beginning. The records were sealed. Reports vanished into archives marked confidential, then quietly disappeared altogether. The church issued no statement, the county no explanation. Instead, the graves were closed again, the soil pressed flat, the grass allowed to grow as if nothing had ever been disturbed. But those who were present carried the knowledge with them until their own deaths. They spoke little, yet their silence became its own form of testimony. It was not ignorance that had kept the Crosbys' secret hidden for so long. It was denial, chosen and enforced, because some truths were too heavy for the parish to bear. The Crosbys were gone, yet their absence left more weight than their presence ever had. After the fire and the strange burials, Aurelia Parish changed in quiet ways. New laws were written into practice, though never spoken of directly. No coffin was allowed into the ground without witnesses confirming the body inside. Families were made to stand and watch as lids were sealed, names recorded, signatures taken. Ministers prayed longer at gravesides, as if trying to anchor the dead to the earth, afraid that without oversight they too might dissolve into ash. The rituals of burial became less about honoring life and more about defending against what had already happened once. But law could not erase fear. The name Crosby lingered like smoke in the parish, a word spoken in hushed tones carried with suspicion across generations. Children were warned never to wander near the ruined plantation, never to walk the churchyard after dark, never to ask questions about the coffins. Mothers whispered to each other that those who pried too deeply into the family's story often vanished. A school teacher who lectured too openly about the fire was found drowned in a creek, his notes gone. A man who attempted to dig near the ruined house never returned home, his tools left scattered in the mud. The parish learned to bury not only its dead, but its curiosity. Silence became its own form of protection, a way to keep whatever had consumed the Crosbys from spreading further. Yet silence also carried corruption. Fear settled into daily life, shaping the way people spoke, the way they looked at strangers, the way they prayed. Evil had not ended with the family's erasure. It had taken root in the soil, in the laws, in the unspoken rules that governed how one lived in Aurelia Parish. And every generation carried the weight of knowing that to speak the name too often was to invite the possibility of joining the countless others who never returned. When the Crosbys were gone, the parish tried to move forward, but the ground never let them forget. The house was reduced to rubble, the family name erased from records, the coffins filled with ash buried deep beneath the churchyard. No heirs survived, no bloodline remained to carry their story onward. And yet their presence lingered in the soil, in the laws that demanded witnesses at burials, in the memorial stones placed with unease, in the prayers whispered at night by families too afraid to say aloud what they truly feared. The Crosbys had left nothing living, but the memory of their cruelty became immortal. Evil, the parish learned, does not always wear the face of rage. It does not always announce itself with blood or weapons. Sometimes it wears the mask of piety, a quiet smile in the pew, a bowed head, a steady hand offering help. The Crosbys embodied normalcy so carefully that no one questioned them until it was too late. Their rituals hid behind the language of faith, their experiments behind the veil of discipline, their silence behind the appearance of order. They taught the parish that the most dangerous cruelty is not the kind shouted aloud, but the kind whispered in prayer, repeated in daily routine, disguised as duty. What they left behind was not only ash, but fear woven into the fabric of life itself. Parents taught children not to ask too many questions. Officials learned to seal records rather than expose truth. And communities grew suspicious of anyone who smiled too calmly or prayed too often in silence. The Crosbys showed that evil can thrive in plain sight, that it can be mistaken for devotion, that it can stand beside you in church and watch as the world burns. Their story closes not with resolution but with reflection. Evil often survives through silence, through the willingness of others to look away, to deny what they see, to bury what they fear. The Crosbys are gone, their house reduced to dust, their graves filled with nothing but powder. Yet their legacy lingers in every law, every whisper, every prayer that still trembles in Aurelia Parish. And so the question remains, what do you think? Could this happen again?